Hello and welcome to Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. My name is Christopher Sands and I'm Director of the Center for Canadian Studies here at Johns Hopkins. And it is a pleasure to be able to bring to you the 2021 Thomas O. Enders Memorial Lecture on U.S.-Canadian Relations. It's always the highlight of our academic year, and we have a particularly good speaker this year, David Dodge, well known to Johns Hopkins and well known to, I'm sure, many of you on an important subject here today. The Thomas O. Enders Memorial Lecture honors the memory of, obviously, Thomas O. Enders, who was a U.S. Ambassador to Canada during the Gerald Ford administration. That was a particularly crucial time in the Canada-U.S. relationship that included Canada's joining the G7 and tense negotiations over dealing with inflation and other challenges. His family has endowed the lecture in his memory, and we're really pleased that we've been able to put it on. I also want to thank in advance the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which has helped us spread the word and support this lecture. Some of you know it's my other house, and it's a great team up to be able to bring the two institutions together. To kick us off, I'm going to turn to one of the longest standing directors of the Center for Canadian Studies, the director of the Canadian Studies program at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Charles Duran. Charles, I'll turn to you to introduce our speaker, and I know you know him well.
Well, thanks, Chris. Yes, it is a great pleasure to introduce David Dodge. Both David and Chris have been old friends of mine for more decades than we want to mention here. So the topic that he has to talk to us about is as appropriate as any could possibly be. David Dodge is, of course, well known to Canadians and Americans. He is the former 7-year term governor of the Bank of Canada. He also has been for 2 terms chancellor of Queen's University, one of the leading universities in Canada. Since this time, David has been with the distinguished law firm Bennett Jones as a senior advisor. He also has co-chaired the Global Market Monitoring Group of the Institute of International Finance. He is chairman of the board of the directors of the C.D. Howe Institute and also of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, as well as a member of other boards. Now, I have to tell you, for those of you who know how important this is, he has been the deputy minister both of the Department of Health, the Ministry of Health, and also the Ministry of Finance. Now, I have to just summarize this by saying this. David is a leader. That's what all of these appointments tell me. And his topic today is so well chosen. The title might be a little long, but the topic is perfect. Post-pandemic productivity, federal fiscal stimulus investments and productivity improvements in the United States and Canada. David, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck, my friend, not old friend, but friend of long standing. It's a great pleasure to be back at SAIS, if only virtually. And it's a real honor for me to be giving this lecture to recognize the contribution of Thomas Enders. Today I want to start, as Chuck just said, by focusing on economic challenges that Canada faced, and then I'm going to turn to the Canada-U.S. relations and how that fits in to our economic challenge. You know, at least in the short run, the challenges are the same in both of our countries, indeed in all countries of the world, and that is to manage the spread of the virus through social distancing until such time as the vaccines can dramatically reduce contagion and severity of the virus. In the US, this is likely to be achieved probably by midsummer. Canada and Europe, not until the fall, but unfortunately, much later in the rest of the world. So, but following, once we get the virus under control, it is going to have some enduring impacts. Clearly, it probably is going to result in shortened supply lines, reduced travel, and some reduction in the global division of labor. It also has provided a real incentive for digitization, which over the long run should lead to some productivity improvement. And finally, of course, and this has been building for a while, we're also likely now to see an increasing silicon barrier down the Pacific, which will influence the trade that both Canada and the US has with Asia and in particular China. But essentially, the global policy challenges that we have in Canada and that the world has following COVID are basically the same as before. We all have a climate change challenge. We all have challenges to income distribution. We're all going to have to adapt to a digital world. And finally, all governments are going to have to find ways to manage this fourth industrial revolution. And it's against that context, I want to explore the economic challenges faced largely by Canadian policymakers and how that interacts with US challenges. So being an economist and being a former academic, I always want to start with the basic context and the basic economic framework and note several points. First, in the long run, no country can sustain its consumption by borrowing from foreigners. Canadians and all countries really have to increase the value of what we produce and sell abroad if we want to increase our living standards over time. Second, to be able to consume more in the future, Canada must produce more, and this requires more investment today. This means deferring some immediate consumption, however difficult that may be, both for Canadians and the politicians who represent them. Third, effort has to be directed to producing goods and services in which a country, and in our case Canada, has the greatest comparative advantage. While at the same time, and this is a bit of a change from where we were before COVID, at the same time, nurturing production to ensure resiliency of our economies in key areas, i.e. to provide some insurance against disruptions of key supply chains, such as vaccines. Fourth, in all of our countries, we have to ensure that productivity increases are fast enough, not only just to offset the impact of population aging, but also to provide increased levels of consumption in the future. And finally, and fifth, government finances have to be sustainable. So that's the economics lesson. And so the question is, how were we addressing those challenges in Canada pre-pandemic? And then I'll move on to post-pandemic. Well, first, let me start with five key conditions. First, since the great financial crisis, Canada has consistently borrowed abroad to finance a current account deficit of between 2 and 4% of GDP. That borrowing abroad was needed to finance investment here at home because Canadians were basically consuming all of their income. Prior to 2008, Canadians consumed about 88% of the income we produced. In 2019, it was 96%. Of course, in 2020, it was 110%, but that was a one-off effect of the COVID situation, and that was true in other countries, including the U.S. as well. Second challenge we had is related to business non-residential investment. Non-residential investment as a share of GDP in Canada have fallen from about 13.5% in 2014-15, which is about the same as in the United States, to about 10.5% by 2019, largely because of the decline in oil and gas investment. But all the other areas were weak as well. Machinery and equipment investment constituted only 3% of Canadian GDP versus 5.5% in the US. Only 2% of GDP was invested in IP as compared to about 5% in the US. And then finally, business R&D accounted for only 0.5% of Canadian GDP versus about 2.5% in the US. So the real issue in Canada was the lack of private investment. Third challenge that we faced was productivity. Productivity growth, in fact, in both of our countries since the great financial crisis has been weak, but Canada has been consistently lower than the United States. Moreover, the ratio of our working age population to the total population will decrease by about 2 percentage points over the remainder of the decade. And this is pointing to even further deterioration in Canada's relative performance on the productivity side. The fourth challenge we had, as I mentioned earlier, was our current account balance. Current account balance had declined from an annual surplus in the order of 2% of GDP around the year 2000 to a deficit of about 3% of GDP in 2018-19. This was largely due to a dramatic fall, deterioration in the balance in three key areas: electronics, automobiles and transportation equipment, and consumer goods. And it was only in the area of energy and largely oil and gas that Canada had maintained a positive balance of about 3 to 4% of GDP. So that kind of illustrates part of the problem, and it shows the big challenge that we have been facing and will face in spades going forward of reducing greenhouse gas emissions when we have relied so heavily on oil and gas exports to pay for our imports of other things. So the fifth issue, the fifth challenge, is actually a positive factor for Canada. In the years following the great financial crisis, the federal government actually ran fairly modest but clearly positive fiscal surpluses, and since then only very small deficits. Most provinces ran throughout the course of the period after the great financial crisis. They also ran deficits, but not huge ones. The result of which, on both sides, is that by 2019, the net debt of provinces combined to about 30% of GDP, and the federal government about 35%, giving us a total debt to GDP ratio, which was by far the lowest in the G7, and actually quite well relatively. So we actually, at the time COVID struck, we had a degree of fiscal room that many other countries, or most other countries, didn't have, including the United States. But let me summarize then where our challenges were going into the pandemic. We face serious economic challenges in terms of excessive consumption, high and rising private debt, weak private investment, an aging population, deteriorating current account, offset only in part by the fact that we really did have sustainable public finances. So, but what has changed, or how is it different as we emerge from COVID? All those challenges remain, but we have used up much of the margin of comfort that we had on the public finance side. But let me go through three broad challenges that are somewhat different, I think, now as we emerge from the pandemic-induced restrictions later in the year. First of all, the global context is a bit different, but most importantly, the US policy context is a bit different. The Biden plans for infrastructure and families mean strong US demand for Canadian goods and services going forward, even though the Buy America policies will pose a challenge, not just for us, but of course for the Mexicans as the other partner in CUSMA. Biden's tax plans actually create a real opportunity, I think, for us for a better structured tax system, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And finally, Biden's strategy with respect to China, I think it implies that somehow we in North America will need to forge much stronger supply lines for the manufacturing and production of green goods, whether they be capital equipment, machinery and equipment, automobiles, electronics, and energy. And so in part then, all of this raises a big question for Canada. How do we together participate with the United States as we build a stronger North America to deal with global economic and technological challenges? The second area that's somewhat different or heightened, I would say, since the great financial, or since the pandemic, is the issue of climate change. Around the world, climate change rules are tightening. Promises to deal with climate change have been greatly expanded. And indeed, our Prime Minister has been pushed into raising our targets here in this country, and that's going to be difficult. We have a carbon tax that may enable us to deal with the demand side, although it raises big questions about border adjustments. But what we don't have is the capacity to produce hydrocarbon, greenhouse gas efficient energy and capital goods. So that is a heightened challenge that was there from before. And then finally, I think we all face social policy challenges. The pandemic has heightened the difficulty of people at the bottom end of the income scale. It has heightened the burden that is on women who participate in the labor force, and it has heightened the differences between folks that rely on income from capital and those that rely on labor income. So those are, if you will, challenges which have been heightened or vary somewhat from what we had before. So how does it seem that we're trying to address these challenges in Canada? At least if one looks at all the recent provincial and federal budgets. After all, a budget is supposed to spell out the plan for economic stabilization, for the allocation of resources, and for distribution. So the question is, looking at our budgets, how do those plans square with the challenges that I've just run through? Well, I would say first, with respect to the growth challenge or the investment challenge, neither the federal nor provincial budgets focus on the critical issues related to this growth challenge. There is no federal or plan in the Alberta budget for adaptation of the oil and gas industry. There's no mention of how we're going to go about carbon capture and storage, or enhanced oil recovery, or we don't even find real nods to the necessity for technical innovation within the oil and gas industry, and even more importantly, for reorientation of the industry to produce non-hydrocarbon exports. So, for example, there's no plan for the adaptation of the gas industry to produce hydrogen. And in Alberta, the province most affected, we really have no strategic plan at all for an alternative anchor for growth in the province, whether that be information technology, digital technologies, or artificial intelligence. And that is really, I think, very unfortunate because there are opportunities there if governments would seize on them. And finally, we don't find in any of the provincial budgets or in the federal budget a real thrust with respect to training and education to meet the new challenges going forward and to adapt our labor force to the new structure of industrial production. Secondly, in neither the federal or provincial governments budgets do we find plans to facilitate the investment by the private sector in structures, machinery, and equipment needed to build green production. We can't go green in terms of energy production in this country at the moment without huge imports of solar equipment, wind equipment, and so on. And we have no emphasis at all on the investment necessary to retool the auto industry, for example, or to rebuild our electric transmission system so that we can adapt to the variable production of power that comes through green power. We have nothing in respect to building capacity to manufacture windmills, solar panels, enhanced nuclear production. Small nuclear reactors, for example, are not mentioned, and nothing in terms of investment in hydroelectric. So we've kind of missed an opportunity there to supply the goods and capital equipment for a green world. All the emphasis has been on changing the demand structure in this country, and that we do have tools. After all, we do have a carbon tax, which is slated to increase. But the fact we can't supply is a big issue, since our exports of oil and gas are going to fall. And we have to find some way then to supply the green capital equipment without exacerbating our current account problems. There's no major thrust in either federal or provincial budgets to provide tax incentives to induce increased supply of green energy. Carbon tax has everything to do with demand, not with the supply of that energy. In the federal budget, here I'm turning just to the federal budget, there's about $20 billion of spending in one way or another devoted to investment, at least if one interprets that liberally, much of which, half of which is for classic investment in transit and transportation, and only a very little bit, about 1 billion, a little more than 1 billion, devoted to the digital economy, a couple of billion to clean energy. So I think adding all that up, in sum, out of 100 billion of so-called initiatives in the federal budget, less than 20 billion has been devoted to something that will enhance our capacity for economic growth. And on the provincial side, going through all the provincial budgets, they were essentially static with respect to their capital investment. And where they were putting it, as always, was largely in schools, roads, hospitals, and transit, all of which are helpful, but don't necessarily increase production. So the second area I mentioned was social support. And here what we see in the budgets is a continued emphasis on income support and public consumption. And as is in the US, the federal government has continued or extended temporary personal and small business support through the end of the summer. And this constitutes, this temporary support is actually bigger in magnitude than the support over 5 years for investment and growth. But the federal government has laid out a rather ambitious plan to bolster household incomes and enhance consumption in that regard. $30 billion, that's about 30% of what they're committing to over the next 5 years, is for child support, which certainly benefits middle and upper middle income, certain upper and middle income families. There is one very good but small enhancement of the benefit for low income workers. There's a really quite unnecessary increase in old age security payments. And finally, a rather large chunk of money, 13 billion for additional supports to the indigenous community. So we have essentially a very much a social thrust in the federal budget without the necessary economic thrust that will produce the income over time to support that social thrust. Finally, I would say that in contrast to Mr. Biden's infrastructure and family plans, Canada's $100 billion plan laid out in the federal budget is really less than a game changer. So in comparison terms, it's, say, a fourth, relatively speaking, as big as the Biden plan. So it's not going to be the transformative effort that Biden has sent out. But moreover, Mr. Biden at least acknowledges that he's going to have to pay for some of this through taxes. The Canadian plan has no plan to raise taxes, either federally or provincially, other than a little Netflix tax, which over time is likely to disappear. So So whether it's on the expenditure side or the tax side, there's nothing, in fact, that gives one confidence that we have taken an opportunity to enhance growth going forward. Finally, just let me talk about fiscal sustainability briefly. As I said earlier, we had a very good position coming into the COVID experience. We still will have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. It'll be up to close to 90% now GDP compared to what it was. But nevertheless, what that means is that we don't have the room going forward to deal with any new crisis that emerges. So that's my quick summary of where we have, how we've adjusted following the COVID, or planning to adjust, I'm sorry, following the COVID period. Let me now move on to an issue which Thomas Enders, were he still with us, would be very interested in, because this is what he dealt a lot with when he was camped here in Ottawa. So let me start the discussion with the challenges faced by promoting growth in this rapidly changing global and technological context, with a few words on how Canada might seek to define its place in the global economy, its relationship with the United States, and its participation in the global trading order. Canada has a solid foundation of trade agreements, but its relationships, in particular with the United States, in fact, have to deepen going forward. We have to have a careful delineation of where Canadian can supply goods and services to adapt to global developments, and where we invest in cooperation with other countries to influence the outcomes, and where we seek to differentiate Canada from other countries and areas in which we seek to lead. Investment may then respond to clear strategic signals and to known rules of the game. That really is critical. The unpredictability of US policy under President Trump was a powerful reminder that Canada cannot simply count on the United States to expand trade and to guide its wider international relationships. Having said that, however, there remains for the foreseeable future no relationship anywhere near as important to Canada as the one with the United States, and no economic, policy, and business signals more germane to the strategic choices of Canada than those that will come from south of our border. The first 100 days of the Biden administration have put in motion ambitious actions and plans to create a new and evolving economic momentum, and that may create some competitive challenges for Canada, but most of it may actually open up opportunities for Canada to capitalize on some of our strengths. The Biden administration is proposing to push forward over the next 8 to 10 years with significant public investment in such volume that create the prospect of a strong US economic expansion over the medium term, and which, despite the Buy American provisions, will have really positive spillovers for the Canadian, Mexican, and global economies. And while Canadian governments and businesses have to borrow prudently to capitalize on that, Canada can really benefit from stronger US demand if, and only if, and I think this is important, Canadian industries primary, manufacturing, and service industries alike invest and compete, backed by appropriate support from federal and provincial governments. Canada will need to be attentive to how U.S. public investment, and the response of U.S. businesses and how they affect our competitive landscape. The Biden administration's intent on taking the challenge posed by the rise of China, notably for infrastructure, critical supplies, and for technologies from clean energy to artificial intelligence that will shape its global competitive advantage. Canada generally will benefit from that more competitive U.S. economy, but Canada will also have to rise to the challenge, both by seeking opportunities for collaboration and partnership with U.S. government and business, for example, for a modernized integrated industry for automobile parts and batteries, and by investing strategically to compete so that North America can compete globally. The Biden plans to raise over the next 15 years some $4 billion of additional taxes on corporations, if adopted by Congress, a big if, of course, would represent a substantial opportunity for Canada and for the Canadian corporate tax system to evolve in a very good way while maintaining our source of revenue. The Made in America tax plan proposes to raise the federal corporate tax rate, but more importantly, from our point of view, it seeks international agreements to ensure that all multinational enterprises pay a minimum rate of corporate tax in the jurisdictions in which they operate. And this is a huge, huge benefit, I think, for finance ministries around the world, and including ours, that we will not lose revenue to the very low tax jurisdictions. So this is a long-standing effort that we have supported at the OECD, and one that, if it's legislated, I think will be of enormous advantage. A key point is that, unlike Canada, though, the United States really has to raise its additional revenue from either corporate or personal income taxes, whereas we actually have the advantage of a value-added consumption tax in order to meet the revenue needs of our governments going forward. And this really is an important competitive advantage for us. Biden policies with respect to climate change also represent another game changer for us here in Canada. A more concerted global effort with strong U.S. participation may enable Canada to implement more ambitious climate change without loss of competitiveness. In domains such as the regulation of vehicle emissions, Canada can also do so in concert with the United States. Yet, there can be no understatement for us of the effort necessary to meet the new pledge by our Prime Minister to reduce our emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030. The oil and gas sector, which has represented 20% of our exports over the period 2010 to 2019, is also the source of 26% of Canada's emissions. And so Canada has to find the means to sustain the oil and gas sector's critical contribution to our trade balance over the decades, while at the same time decarbonizing that industry and making gains elsewhere. There will be opportunities to do so in collaboration with the U.S. In an integrated energy and economic space. And I think that's really important to note. And I just say that, you know, picking up this morning's paper, it's really unfortunate that Governor Whitman's attempt to close absolutely critical pipeline into Canada, that really doesn't represent a very promising start to the cooperative efforts we're all going to have to make. Finally, on climate, it's not merely a matter of lowering domestic emissions, however monumental that task may be. It's a matter for both Canada and the United States of driving competitive advantage as our energy systems and our economies make a critical transformation towards lower and ultimately net zero emissions. If Canada loses over time the benefit of energy exports and finds itself importing everything from technology, services, and equipment for energy efficiency, clean fuels, clean power, and so on, there will be a significant loss of economic wealth. Canada, like the US, must chart a path by identifying not only how its economy can make the transition, but where and how our resources, goods and services industries may be part of energy solutions for the world. This will entail investment in innovation and the capture of intellectual property and the participation of new high value added supply chains. And it will entail enhanced Canada-US cooperation. Let me just make one more point on the structural changes, and that relates to the digital economy and its winner take all forces that require concentrated effort through competition, investment, and intellectual property and data management policy frameworks to create the space for North American firms to emerge, grow, and capture global market share. This is a particular challenge, of course, for us in Canada in the technology space. For example, while Canada has developed and attracted world-class talent in artificial intelligence, and our universities have built global centers of excellence so that Canada could be an innovation leader. But this capital has not, as yet, we've not capitalized, our Canadian firms have not capitalized on this. And if this intellectual capital that we built is to be leveraged principally by foreign firms, particularly big tech, then Canada will not do well. In fact, we will need to move forward in the IP space to realize the value of our innovation capacity. Investment must be channeled as a priority into building Canadian success stories in the intellectual property space as Canada, like the US, meets the challenge of Chinese import competition. Finally, in closing, now I would like to note that the renewed emphasis placed by the Biden administration on strengthening rules for global trade means that once again the WTO may play an important role in shaping trade rules. This represents an opportunity for Canada to exercise influence in shaping the evolution of those rules. More importantly, in the shorter term, it'll give Canada access to a more effective tribunal to settle normal ongoing trade disputes with our trading partners, including the United States. In a world where China-US conflicts are undoubtedly going to be settled bilaterally, the WTO can provide the forum for ensuring a reasonable framework for smaller countries such as Canada to deal with the two giants, and most importantly, to deal with each other. Canada will need to increase its effort to strengthen the WTO framework. We will have to work with the United States to do this now that the US is back in the game. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to leave it at that point. I've absorbed your attention for far too long. I now look forward to discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David Dodge. Let me turn now to a real treat, Dr. Alice Enders, who is a PhD economist, graduate of Queen's University, an excellent school with which our speaker has more than a passing acquaintance. But in particular, we're delighted to have her because she is the daughter of Ambassador Enders. And so let me turn it over to you, Alice Enders. I think you're still muted, Alice, unfortunately.
Well, David, I just wanted to say that as an economist living in the UK, much of what you were speaking about resonates with me. I wanted to thank you on behalf of the family, of course, for holding up your end and celebrating the memory of my father, with whom naturally, I had a rather bucolic existence in Ottawa when I was attending Ottawa University before going on and doing a PhD at Queen's University in economics, and then going on to work, in fact, at the WTO. I think that for those of us who have been outside of North America and looking from the outside in, and looking at those first 100 days and looking at where Canada has been really a leader, a beacon of light, even in a period of darkness. You mentioned climate change, and we in the UK and in Europe and other places, of course, who are, UK's hosting COP26 this year in Glasgow, have been very concerned about advancing the climate crisis agenda. And obviously for us, the biggest change of all is that North America is now united on this point. However, I think you mentioned in passing that, you know, there's a slim majority in the House, but it strikes me that Canada has a lot to teach the US on climate change. And that, I think, has a lot of implications for service industries, who are here. We have reporting standards like you have in Canada. You know, people are taking this very seriously. It's a huge part of, you know, young people's aspirations for the society they live in. I think this is something that we now welcome, obviously, with the Biden administration. So there's a lot of convergence all of a sudden around that crucial objective. As you suggest, it's embraced by Canada. It's been a beacon of light in a long period of darkness. You know, my father was actually Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs during the energy crisis. And so he was very involved in the creation of the International Energy Agency and the issue of energy policy in the US, which, as we know, concerns Texas to a huge extent. So there's convergence in this, but, you know, Canada can maybe make it happen more in the US. However, this pandemic has created a new divergence, which I wanted to get your comment on. You mentioned CUSMA, how important that is, the issues around the supply chains and so on. How is the border now impeding movement? Has, you know, what we're seeing, you know, in Europe is, of course, a lot of travel restrictions. You know, a lot of what the CUSMA delivered was cross-border movement, investors, businesses, students. You know, Chris took groups to Alberta that were funded by the whatever. What about all that movement? Wasn't that so important? And couldn't that be another factor of importance in terms of motivating that cross-border richness that is actually engaged in people? And so I just wanted you to comment on the border, CUSMA, mobility, restoring mobility. How do you see that playing a role in terms of overcoming some of these, climate change is a bigger challenge in the US legislatively relative to Canada. So, how can movement of people, ideas enhance the debate in the US and create a united front from North America on climate change for the first time ever?
Well, the impact of the pandemic has been to block up exchange, both personal exchanges across the border, and made not totally impeded, but made the exchange of goods more difficult as well. Now that hopefully is temporary, but I think there may be, unfortunately, Alice, some lasting effects that have come out of that. In some ways, one gets the feeling here that the Canadian and US societies, certainly during the 4 years of the Trump presidency, were in some sense growing apart a little bit. And so whether the thrust from the Biden administration will revert, hope it's got to reverse it. It can't go in the bad direction it was going. But whether it will bring us back quickly to where we were in 2015, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And I think that's on both of our parts, both on the part of Canadians that now seem less enthusiastic about keeping that border open and doing everything behind the scenes to keep it open with respect to trade. I can only hope that we will be able to move forward. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that the political context of the last 4 years probably has an ongoing, unfortunate, negative impact on the, let's say, the seamlessness of Canada and the United States in the North American economy.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you
go
so
ahead,
much,
sorry.
David. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to thank David about, for that. I also wanted to mention that, you've been an educator. I wanted to ask you about your experience, across these different spheres, if I could. You were Bank of Canada governor, you were Chancellor of Queen's University, you've been an educator, you're a thinker. The last 4 years have been challenging for everyone outside the US too. And I think there could well be a time with the Canada Institute, for example, now, reactivating its activity. We're in a period, I think, of convergence, I hope. I know you mentioned the divergence having left many sequels that must be resolved and so on, but let's talk about ways of converging the US and Canada now that it's feasible, and maybe the Canada Institute could be a factor. What do you think of that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's clearly the advantage of both countries, both from trade. The trade side, But obviously, I think from the sort of general political and social side, that the rifts that have opened up be healed and move forward. And to the extent that we can do that from the sidelines, so to speak, in our universities, in our research institutes, to the extent we can contribute to that, then I think that's an enormous advantage, because I think both in terms of research and in terms of teaching and learning, we kind of do move together down the same path. It is a path of convergence, not one of divergence. And so I absolutely agree with you that to the extent we can make a contribution. And if we increase our effort in that regard, that it will be a real payoff.
Excellent. David, I have a question from John Curtin at the University of Toronto. John, can you ask the question or send it through the ether? John, I know you have a question. I just don't know what it is. Oh, there. Well, while we're trying to get John's question through, Chuck, do you want to weigh in with a question? You're notorious in seminars at SAIS for asking the killer question that sets things right.
I don't want to specialize in killer questions, but I think David is equal to any question I might pose. David, can you comment on the view of some people down here, or your own view, forget the people down here, about the fear that maybe all this spending down here is going to get inflation going again, and we're suddenly going to be going off in the wrong direction?
Yeah, well, yeah, I can. First, let's be clear that in the very short run, as we make the adjustment from where we were to an economy that is functioning more or less normally, if you will, we've got supply problems in a number of sectors. That's inevitably happens, and so in the short run, we're going to see a bump, certainly in industrial prices, and that's going to feed through in the short run into consumer prices. I think that is relatively short run. That is a phenomenon that probably pretty much plays itself out by the time we get to 2023. But yeah, one expects that. And in flexible inflation targeting, central banks look through that. So then the question is, and so that should not have posed a problem. The question I think all of us ask is this kind of open-ended average inflation targeting that the Fed has announced. What the hell does that mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that's very unfortunate, because they did not announce a price level target, which we all could have adapted to in the private sector. We would understand how it would operate, just as we understand how flexible inflation targeting operates. I think we're all a bit at sea now in the financial world as to exactly what this means. And so I think that poses a risk, Chuck, that this short-term burst of inflation, which normally we would just look through, it would be there and then we would expect it to come down, we'd be back on track, that people will not look through it because they're uncertain as to how the Fed is going to operate then in the future once that materializes. And so it's conceivable that we get a change in expectations, which become cumulative rather than ones that expect the inflation to taper down. And I think that is a risk, and it's a risk in both of our countries. In fact, in much of the Western world, at a time when our labor force as a share of our population is actually going to be declining. And so there is sort of, if you will, a long run tendency to put some pressure on prices just because of the demographics. So I'm not sure that I'm of the real worrywart school on inflation. That the worrywart school that it's all a monetary phenomenon and we're bound to have inflation. I don't think that's true. On the other hand, one is a bit worried as we let go of our anchors, as the Fed is letting go of its anchor. And it's always been a bit of a worry in the United States with the dual mandate, especially when that gets interpreted as not a high level of employment, but a maximum level of employment. So I would say that that's the longer term worry. The short term worry, yeah, we're going to have inflation, but that I don't think that's a big problem. The problem is if it gets entrenched and built in going forward.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. And David, I have good news for you and for Chuck. John Curtin found a way to get me the question and said, darn it, Chuck asked my question pretty much as I would have asked it. So thank you to John Curtin for weighing in. Thanks, Chuck, for carrying that message forward. And thanks, David, for a wonderful lecture. We've come to our time. And so unfortunately, we have to conclude. But I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to thank the Canada Institute at Wilson Center for their support, the great team at SAIS Johns Hopkins for giving us all of this technology support, many people behind the scenes, including Sonia Holmes and Pedro Matias, who've been just great today. Thanks to everyone involved, and most of all, thanks to our speaker, David Dodge, for making time for this, and to Alice Enders and the Enders family for supporting this important exchange on Canada-US relations. That's all from here. Thank you, everyone. See you again next year.